Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, a series of casual conversations about the most important issues affecting the Middle East region today. I'm Brian Katulis. I'm senior fellow here at MEI and host of the podcast. And today I'm joined by Dan Shapiro. A brief message to our listeners. We're excited to announce that Taking the Edge Off the Middle East is launching its own independent channel after more than a year of being hosted by our friends and colleagues here at Middle East Focus. You can find us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Be sure to follow, review, and subscribe. Your support makes all of this possible. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
You've had a long, distinguished career, and you're not done yet. You've served in Congress as a staffer. You were a senior official at the National Security Council in the Obama administration. You were the U.S. ambassador to Israel in some quiet periods, 2011 to 2017 or so. And then most recently, you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon in 2024. You joined at the start of that year, a very tumultuous year. I want to start where we start with most of these discussions today. How do you assess the Trump administration 2 months in to office, how it's handling the Middle East? What's good, what's bad, what's unclear? How do you see things?
First, thanks for having me, Brian. I think there's a lot that's still ill-defined about the Trump administration's policies on the Middle East. Frankly, I'd say many of its policies, and that's to some degree normal early in an administration. While not everybody has arrived at their jobs and not every issue has been fully vetted, but it makes it hard to identify an overall strategy. I think some of it we see is driven by President Trump's impulses or his instincts. Some of it may be a little more grounded in some, maybe more what we'd say traditional policy thinking. I'd say I identify some good, some bad, and some unsettled. On the good, it started actually even during the transition when he and his envoy, and became his envoy, Steve Witkoff, actually partnered with the outgoing Biden administration on achieving the ceasefire and the hostage deal that was announced on January 19th, the day before Inauguration Day. That was obviously a big win. It involved his own determination and maybe a bit of pressure that he applied on multiple parties who wanted him to have a good news as he was coming into office. But it was also not a given that would be done cooperatively between the outgoing and the incoming administrations, and it was very well. So I give good marks for that. Mm-hmm. I think they've done well in managing and maintaining the ceasefire in Lebanon.
Yes.
And trying to keep that quiet and trying to help the Lebanese armed forces continue to move into the role and the Lebanese government with the new president.
And that was a deal, again, the Biden administration constructed at the end of November 2020.
Absolutely. So I think they've carried that forward well. I think they have recently engaged productively in Syria in order to help encourage a negotiation between the Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces that the U.S. has supported in the defeat ISIS threat, and the new Syrian regime in Damascus to try to, and has produced an agreement to try to integrate those two into one set of national institutions. And I'm sure we'll talk about it more. I agree with the decision to conduct strikes against the Houthis.
Right. You wrote about that in Foreign Policy.
Right. Recently. And we can talk more about that. But I think that was a necessary and correct decision. On the less positive side, I think President Trump surprised everybody, including his own team, and probably Prime Minister Netanyahu as well, with the announcement in the press conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu in early February of his Gaza Riviera plan. This is not a serious plan.
Right.
There's no prospect of 2 million Palestinians leaving Gaza and being relocated somewhere else, and America taking ownership with no U.S. troops and no U.S. dollars spent to build a big set of vacation hotels. This is not serious.
Why do you think he did it?
Well, I think it was an instinct that he, as a kind of real estate developer, sort of thinks that this is how you solve problems. But it wasn't vetted by his own team. It wasn't discussed with Arab states whose support you would need to make any of it viable. It, I think, to some degree has boxed the Israeli leadership in by outflanking them from the right. So now they're sort of committed to this as their day after plan when it's not a serious.
And some on the right in Israel actually were overjoyed, right?
They were, but now they're sort of committed to something that's not a serious plan and has no chance of being implemented. So I think that was a mistake. I think related to that, and maybe also in some ways in the Iranian and the Houthi context, the bellicose retail rhetoric, his Truth Social post that sort of commit to all hell breaking loose and punishment like you've never seen, and all these like all caps threats are hard to back up sometimes.
Right.
It's hard to know who's going to do the backing up.
Uh-huh.
In this case, I think it in some ways also boxed the Israelis in a little bit on how to deal with the lack of the continuation of the ceasefire in Gaza. And so, I think there's wisdom in speaking softly and carrying a big stick.
Right.
I don't, as I said, in the Houthi case, I think it's correct to use the force. I think we have to keep that option on the table with Iran. But these sort of blustery social media posts, I don't know that those are always the best way of communicating what our intentions are, or if it's clear what our intentions are. What's really unsettled for me still is what's the approach going to be on Iran. He has said, and apparently now sent a letter to the Supreme Leader of Iran, that he wants to do negotiations toward a nuclear deal. And that's fine, but that there's a military option if that's not successful. But exactly what those negotiations look like, what's the end goal that he's trying to achieve in terms of a deal, what would be the trigger to decide that no, either U.S. or Israeli or some combination of the two conducting military strikes is the right choice. I think that's still very much a work in progress internally, partly because not everybody has arrived in the administration. I think there's a big question mark hanging over Saudi normalization. We worked very hard in the Biden administration, we can talk more about this, on trying to put in place the bilateral U.S.-Saudi agreements that would have supported a Saudi-Israeli normalization. And there are decisions waiting, I think, that haven't been reached yet by the Trump administration on if they are committed to the same set of types of agreements that we did. And then that broadly connects to the question of the whole U.S. presence and military posture in the region. There are voices in the Trump administration who are saying, well, we don't have such strong interests. We should be leaving Iraq. We should be leaving Syria. We shouldn't make new commitments to the Gulf partners. We should, help the Israelis, but kind of stay out of all of these fights. But there are other voices that, I guess in the Houthi case, have said, well, no, there's still something for us to do.
Right.
But that tension about, where should we be, at what scale, how our defense budget is married up with that, how do we ensure we can project power, or just decide that, our power projection in the Middle East is less important than it might be in Asia or somewhere else. I think those are still very unsettled questions. So
there's a lot of unclarity here. And I've read some articles written by your successor at the Pentagon before he went into office, and he has a much different view than I think some of the others on the Trump team. So it's a little unclear to see how that'll be.
Right. Those internal tensions will play out over time as various people arrive. Now, I also would say it's hard to disconnect the unsettled nature of the policy from the broader Trump foreign policy. Right. We've seen President Trump distancing the United States from all of our traditional allies, certainly our NATO allies, certainly Ukraine, Canada. I mean, this kind of criticism of and really raising questions about whether the U.S. would fulfill commitments to defend partners and allies. Even though he hasn't yet said that about Middle East partners, I know our Asian partners, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, are starting to ask the question, gee, can we count on the United States? If I were a Middle East partner, I'd be starting to ask that question too.
I heard that in the first couple of weeks of the second administration. I was in Abu Dhabi. I was in several countries in the region. And I heard, what if he's doing this to Canada? What might he do to us? The unpredictability of it is a worry.
And the yearning, I guess you'd call it, for closeness or agreements or arrangements with Russia, with China. We see some of the sort of implications of that in the Ukraine context, where Ukraine's been put under a lot of pressure. Maybe they can get the ceasefire, maybe they can't. But it's really clearly driven by the sense, and he talks about it, that the U.S. and Russia should have a much better relationship, a much closer partnership, and there are things we can do together in the Middle East. And there's probably a derivative approach to China in the same way. Well, even if we are able to work out something with the Russians in Ukraine, I wouldn't assume that our interests in the Middle East are so aligned that we might be able to minimize conflict, but we're going to have to manage competition, I think, with Russia and China in the Middle East, and kind of that's in some tension with this sort of yearning for partnership with his only two peer partners as he sees them, which is Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
Yeah. So multiple choice on the Trump administration. Donald Trump, in his second term, will get the Nobel Peace Prize, in 2025 for getting peace in Ukraine, B, in 2027 for an Israel-Saudi normalization accord that builds on the Abraham Accords, or C, never.
Well, it's hard to make predictions about prizes. It's clearly something that he and his team are kind of campaigning for already.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was in the White House when President Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which was a little bit absurd in his first year when he
because he wasn't George Bush.
He knew, right, exactly, and he knew it was a little bit absurd. But there it is. But look, if he accomplishes big things, and I'm a huge proponent of a Saudi normalization deal, prizes can follow. But look, he has also said some very noteworthy things about his view of the U.S. Defense budget. In addition to saying, we can do deals with Russia, we can do deals with China, and as I understand that, what shapes up is sort of a 19th century spheres of influence style international system of major powers controlling their areas of domination. The U.S. probably in Western Hemisphere, where he's focused on Canada, Greenland, the Panama, the Gulf of America, as he's calling it now.
Yeah.
You can imagine that the questions about U.S. commitment to NATO are going to really diminish NATO if it will even survive this presidency. Mm-hmm. And so that leads to Russia kind of having a sphere of influence in Europe and Eurasia. And again, if I were the Taiwanese or the Australians or the Japanese or the South Koreans, I'd sure be asking, does that seem like the same kind of deal being cut with Xi Jinping? And the tell about this is that he said this only once, and it got lost in a lot of other news, but he said he envisions meeting with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and negotiating a 50% cut in defense spending.
Amazing.
By all three countries. Yeah. Well, a 50% cut in U.S. defense spending, our defense budget in 2024 was $824 billion. A 50% cut would be basically for a hemispheric and homeland defense military. We would not be able to project power to Europe.
It's sort of
Asia.
A gated community mindset, like Mar-a-Lago. You build a high wall, and that's it. Yeah.
So that has real implications for the Middle East, where we might still have some competition, and certainly for Europe and Asia, where we might simply be ceding the field to our, I would say, adversaries or competitors. He may see them as partners.
Next multiple choice. Donald Trump is A, more likely to bomb Tehran in a campaign with Israel. B, he's going to sit down with Tehran to negotiate a grand bargain, or C, just muddle through in his Iran policy.
I expect there to be an attempt at diplomacy. He has sent a letter to the Supreme Leader. He has said he wants to negotiate a deal. He's been very specific in that he sees the deal as addressing the nuclear issue, which, by the way, is sort of a criticism of the nuclear deal that President Obama struck by some, that it didn't address Iran's regional aggression or its proxies or that sort of thing. But what he has said is the only condition is they can't have a nuclear weapon, and he wants to reach that in a deal. And if he can't reach it in a deal, the military option is on the table. So I would expect that over the next 3, 4, 5 months through the spring, there will be some fitful attempt at negotiation, at some kind of diplomacy. There's two problems. One is that what the Iranians would have to provide to ensure that they can never achieve a nuclear weapon, which is a complete removal of their enrichment capability, a complete export of their highly enriched uranium stockpile, intrusive inspections with no deadlines, no sunsets, one of the other main criticisms of the 2015 deal. Right. It's very hard to imagine the Iranian regime agreeing to those terms.
Okay.
And even if they were to agree to those terms, they would demand major sanctions relief without addressing those other problems. A lot of our sanctions are because of their sponsorship of terrorist organizations or their other proliferation activities. So it's very hard for me to see that deal coming together that would satisfy us in that period of time. And by the summer, the Europeans, who are still members of the JCPOA, the 2015 deal, the U.S. withdrew from it in President Trump's first term, they will have to make a decision on triggering what are called the snapback sanctions. Right. That is the reversion to the sanctions because Iran is in violation of the deal, which would take effect, I think, in October. And once they do that, and I think that's the direction they're headed because Iran is in significant violation, then the clock is ticking. Iranians may retaliate by withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or making a sprint to break out, and that's the moment of crisis. So I think some attempt at negotiation in the first half of this year is plausible, but it's very hard to imagine the pieces coming together, and the clock then starts ticking in the summer toward, I think, the crisis point. And so I don't at all rule out that the decision point on military action by Israel, by the United States, or by some combination comes in the fall.
So an attempt at diplomacy not likely to succeed, and then some questions about whether military action is a viable option and whether they'll look at it. Last multiple choice, and sorry for springing this on you. Donald Trump, A, will greenlight the annexation of the West Bank, and Mike Huckabee, his nominee to be the ambassador, will push forward and kill any prospect of a two-state solution along with his ideas for Gaza. B, he really wants this Nobel Prize that people talk about, and he presses for a clearer pathway to a two-state solution and gets the Israel-Saudi normalization accord. Or C, he muddles through, that he doesn't actually produce a big result.
I hate these multiple choice questions about Donald Trump because it requires you to try to read his mind.
Yeah.
I think that's always a fool's errand to try, read President Trump's mind. Yeah. Look, in 2020, he proposed a peace plan just in January, I guess, just before COVID.
And was that a two-state solution peace plan in your estimation or not?
Yeah, sort of, kind of, right? It basically said there'll be some sort of negotiation, and then Israel will be able to annex about 30% of the West Bank. And then the Palestinians, subject to negotiation and security requirements and all that, could have some entity, some called it a state, wouldn't use that word, in the remaining 70%, not contiguous, in the West Bank, and maybe in Gaza, and even a slightly expanded Gaza. This was well before October 7th.
Yeah, so in 2020.
That was 2020.
The Palestinians aren't going anywhere in Trump's mind, right?
Right.
Yeah, they're
not going anywhere. So it kind of greenlit a conditional and partial annexation, but also a smaller and partial sort of sovereignty state for the Palestinians. Well, lots changed since then.
Yeah.
So the Abraham Accords first, which got the Israelis to put annexation on the back burner. Then, of course, October 7th, and it's very difficult to have for any Israeli, even those who have long been supporters of two states, to really have that conversation about the idea of a sovereign Palestinian entity on their borders after the slaughter that they experienced on October 7th. So I think that's sort of in the distance. On the other hand, if it's possible at all, it could only be done over time and probably looking different from some of the previous models and so forth. But it also, if you don't keep it alive, and if you shift to say, based on October 7th or based on the politics of Israeli, the U.S. governments or whatever, we're just going to greenlight annexation. It's very hard, really impossible for me to imagine you get the Saudi normalization deal.
Yeah, there's no pathway.
I just don't think the Saudis can stomach that and normalize with Israel under those conditions. So that would be a big loss, in my judgment. That would make it much harder for us to do what was started in the Abraham Accords, very much a Trump accomplishment, which was the building of this coalition of integrated U.S. partners in the region who help each other do economic and health and education and other types of development, and also our defense partners. By the way, that continues, which I worked on a lot at the Pentagon.
Right.
But and against the common set of adversaries they face, Iran and the various proxies, that would really arrest the progress that I think was started in the Abraham Accords and would really be supercharged by Saudi normalization.
I want to turn a little bit away from current events and the current Trump administration and more to your experience and talk a bit about that. But let me use your experience as someone who worked on Capitol Hill, senior advisor to senators. You worked in the National Security Council. You were at the State Department in a very important senior position in Israel. And then you went to the Pentagon. So you have this multidimensional view of U.S. national security. So before we leave Trump, what do you see? How do you see what he's doing in terms of the so-called reforms, what DOGE is doing, what's been done to USAID? What impact do you think this might have? I know it's still too early to tell and it's unclear, but what impact the plans to cut more staff and downgrade missions around the world, State Department missions and embassies and things like that, what impact do you think this might have on America's ability to shape and influence events in the Middle East?
I'm somebody who believes that government has a value and can shape events and shape situations for the better, both at home and abroad, but also who believes that not everything the government does is done well or done as efficiently as it should be or could not be reformed.
Right.
So some approach to reform, some approach to improvement of performance, I think is warranted. What I object to about the DOGE approach is it's a chainsaw, as Elon Musk sort of demonstrated, and it's a meat axe approach without any serious review or any serious consultation with experts. The people making these decisions are, young tech guys, mostly guys, maybe there's women as well, I'm sure, but who really have never worked in government, who don't know what these programs do,
Right.
Who aren't consulting with experts who can tell them, if you eliminate these programs and therefore the U.S. has lost its soft power influence where we compete with Russia and China, or where U.S. Experts are able to spot disease outbreaks, or where U.S. experts are able to help develop private sector initiatives that keep people from turning to transnational crime or these kinds of things. The result is we're losing very important soft power tools and tools that we have used effectively to reduce conflict, to expand our interest and our influence. So I do think it's a big mistake.
How does this impact in the Middle East? For instance, we just lost recently Congresswoman Nita Lowey, and I know you looked up to her a lot, as I did as well. You hired her, and there was this act. We here at MEI know this because we get into the weeds, but and one of our board members, George Salem, is part of this MEPA, Middle East Partnership efforts, right? And what does this do? What do these moves potentially do?
So the Middle East Partnership Program, named for Nita Lowey, in fact, I tweeted maybe when it was first created that it should be named for her as she was getting ready to retire, is a unique public-private partnership with support from Republicans and Democrats and an outside board made up of both that oversees it to create opportunities for Israeli and Palestinian civil society elements to get to know each other, to meet each other, to find common projects, not necessarily to sit around and talk about peace, but to work on environmental.
So this is the sort of thing on our previous episode, Shira Efron and Ibrahim Dalalshe, an Israeli and Palestinian, had talk about this and say, this is urgent. We need this right now, especially after October 7th.
Absolutely.
Is this still alive, these efforts? Do you know?
Since it was administered by USAID, it's largely frozen at the moment. Now, again, everything's subject to review and improvement and reform, but this was something that had broad bipartisan support, that had Israeli and Palestinian support, that had Arab government support, that was helping not only to create these sort of civil society connections that would ultimately be necessary to undergird any kind of arrangement, whether it's two states or some other model for future Israeli-Palestinian coexistence. And nobody's going anywhere. They're all going to live under that in that same area. But it also undercut some important initiatives to help build a Palestinian private sector in the West Bank, including tech developments that could link to the Israeli startup culture.
And that's the thing that will create jobs.
Jobs.
When I lived and worked in Palestine, and when I talk to these people out there, the entrepreneurs, the last thing they want is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They want to
do business.
They want to do business
with Israeli counterparts. So it has a stabilizing effect. It has a bridge building effect. So to take a meat axe to USAID, even if they weren't trying to, and as a result lose the Nita Lowey MEPA program without any thought to how you could, conduct those programs, maybe through other funding mechanisms or the like, which I gather there is some discussion about. Maybe it can be moved under state, maybe it can move under the Defense Finance Corporation or something else. But maybe you should have thought of that before you basically fire everybody who works for USAID.
It's not the way you do transitions.
Take the sign off the building. So I think it's been very destructive and very haphazard, and we will lose, not just in the Middle East but elsewhere, important abilities to advance our own interests. And you could have achieved a serious reform going a little bit slower and consulting people who actually know what they're talking about.
Yeah. So the rest of the conversation is going to be a bit of a trip down memory lane. So if you'd like to fill up your cup, go for it. But I want you to draw your lessons to the current moment and where we can move forward, because that's what we're interested here at the Middle East Institute. Your most recent position, you entered into the most senior civilian position for the Defense Department and defense policy on the Middle East, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, at a time when America was virtually at war. Even though our troops weren't committed in certain places, they were in threat environments. But we were offering support to Israel at a very volatile time. And I want to start there in the most recent, in part because here we are in March of 2025, and the ceasefire that lasted for about 2 months is over. Take us back a little bit to what was it like to actually just show up for work? And we're good friends with Dana Strahl, who was your predecessor in this position. And there's a hot war in this country that you were the ambassador to. And what are you thinking? How are you thinking about this environment? And what are the big challenges you're facing?
We were actually doing very well. We had planned a Negev Forum Ministerial. That's the meeting of U.S., Israel,
Right.
and 4 Arab governments, except we were going to expand it and include Jordan and Palestinians and Indonesians and some African countries for October 19th, 2023 in Marrakesh. It was all planned.
And I should say this is a pitch to a think tank community, but not ours, but our friends at the Atlantic Council, where you were there before.
Right.
You were part of the N7 initiative.
I had led the N7 initiative of the Atlantic Council.
Yeah.
I supported those efforts by the State Department from there. Then I went into state and was continuing to build to expand it.
Was state too slow? Was the Biden administration too slow to pick up on that? That's a criticism some people have to offer, that in the first 6 to 9 months, and look, a lot was going on. There was COVID. There was a focus on China. There was the concern about rebuilding alliances
There was
after Trump.
elections. Yeah, look, it took a little while, not long, but it took a little while for the Biden administration to get sort of fully bought in to carry forward the Abraham Accords, even though Biden himself during the campaign, I was advising him during the campaign, immediately endorsed the Abraham Accords and said he would do it. But it took a while to get the bureaucracy, fully focused on that. Then with the new Israeli government, the Bennett-Lapid government, the Negev Forum occurred in March of 2022, and that was a big win because it got Israel and the U.S. and 4 Arab governments sitting together. And then the effort was to expand that and institutionalize that. And the State Department worked very hard on that, and there were a lot of working group meetings. There was a big gathering in Abu Dhabi in January of 23 with about 150 representatives of 6 working groups from all 6 countries. So they were making progress on that, and we were supporting it from the N7 initiative at the Atlantic Council. Then I was brought in that summer to really try to carry that forward. And as I said, we were making some very good progress.
And then this hits. Yeah.
I can still see on Earth 2 in my mind's eye, Tony Blinken sitting at a table in Marrakesh on October 19th, surrounded by all these other ministers, and it would have been very meaningful and very important. It didn't happen. After October 7th, we were just in crisis management at the State Department.
Do you think October 7th happened because there was so much progress on these other fronts? I know President Biden had said some statements to that effect, that the prospect of Israel-Saudi normalization.
I think it contributed to Hamas and to some degree Iran and other proxies' motivation to do something that would be very disruptive to all of that. I don't know if it's exactly you can pin it exactly to that timing, but it definitely it was part of their motivation to disrupt. So I helped manage. A lot of the normalization work was frozen, so I helped manage the crisis for the first couple of months at state. And then Dana Stroul was leaving. She extended her time, but then she was leaving the Defense Department. And I sat with her for a long time because I had never worked at the Pentagon before. I'd worked at the State Department. I'd worked at the U.S. Embassy in Israel. I'd worked at the NSC. I'd worked on the Hill. But the Pentagon's a totally different animal.
How so?
Different toolbox, right? A different set of different set of tools to use to address these regional interests that we have. Obviously, military tools, but military tools can be used either kinetically or in deterrence, and in partnerships, and in support of humanitarian as well as in support of more destructive kinds of operations. So there's a whole range, and of course, the civilian side of the Pentagon works side by side and hand in glove with the military, with the Joint Staff and with U.S. Central Command. So a lot for me to learn. In fact, I got over there on January 8th, and one of the reasons I had actually pushed to get there, even though it was like halfway through a federal government pay period, so it's very hard for the bureaucracies of state and DOD to pass you off, but we worked it out because I knew based on things that had happened in late December that we were getting very close to our first strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. And I thought it'd be important to be in place in time to help contribute to that. So I started on January 8th. On January 9th, I'm still getting like intake briefings from my staff, and someone opens the door and pokes their head in and says, the Houthis have just lit up the Red Sea with 19 drones and 3 cruise missiles, and we were off to the races.
Right.
And over the next 48 hours, we planned the first strikes, which took place on January 11th. And in the course of that planning, I'm sitting in meetings opposite people. I don't know who they are. I don't know what their name is. I don't know what office it represents. I don't know how their office works with my office.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to learn, and it was, drinking from a fire hose to learn.
And the other thing, probably, I'm guessing here, is you don't see your wife. You don't talk to your kids. Like these jobs are hard, right?
And the Pentagon starts really early. So I found myself, getting into the office at 7 a.m., which is something I never did before, and often leaving at about 10 p.m. And so that was, and working through the weekends and so forth.
Yeah.
So, but in the course of mastering that toolbox over the first couple very frenetic months, we were really doing some incredible and amazing things that I feel actually very good about. I mean, I don't feel good about the crisis. I don't feel good about how difficult it was. But we had committed that we were going to support Israel and make sure it had the ability to defend itself and to make sure Hamas could never conduct any kind of attack and hopefully be removed from power. Support the negotiations. We, as DOD, weren't really involved in it, but support those who were negotiating for the release of hostages. Support and enable humanitarian assistance to flow to Palestinian civilians inside Gaza. And their DOD actually installed a temporary pier. It was of mixed success, of course, although it got 20 million pounds of assistance in. But we also worked with the Israelis on numerous other avenues
there were airlifts
to get airlifts and how do you manage food coming to the crossings. And this was something we did coordinated with the Israelis. We then did something really unprecedented, which was we organized and carried out a defense of Israel from the first ever attack by Iran using ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles from Iranian territory against Israel.
This is June 2020.
This is April.
Sorry, April
13th. A dramatic and really unprecedented defense, which also, because so many other partners, British, French, and some regional partners participated, demonstrated the value proposition of what we've been talking about for some years, integrated air and missile defense. How do all of these countries who are basically facing common adversaries work together, share information, share airspace, or coordinate how it's used in order to defeat these types of attacks?
But in your view, and from that April attack, America is essential to this. They're the glue that keeps this together, or can you do this without America, as some people say?
You can't do it without America. Israel has very significant capabilities to defend itself, and of course we were in support of their own missile defense, but to stitch together that kind of regional architecture requires the United States. And actually, one of the really important things that happened, it happened at the very beginning of the Biden administration, although it was a decision taken at the end of the Trump administration, was to move Israel into the area of responsibility of U.S. CENTCOM. Before it had been part of European Command, EUCOM. And that made an enormous difference because it meant that the same U.S. military commanders who were focused on helping defend Arab states and working with Arab militaries against Iran, against the other Iranian proxies, could now be in the same degree of intimate coordination with Israel against the same set of adversaries and stitch together that coordination between countries that did have relations with Israel and even countries that did not have relations with Israel. And I give huge credit to General Eric Kurilla and his team at CENTCOM, not just for doing that kind of architecture building, but for the trust and the relationships they built with the Israelis and with the others, but which really made all of this possible.
So is China doing this?
No.
Is Russia doing this?
No.
Is Europe doing this?
No.
Okay, so America plays that unique role, and you're in there, you're in the hot seat, you're drinking from the fire hose, you said, in 2024. Let me ask you a question, and hopefully it's not a curveball and too tricky. The debate about the war between Israel and Hamas and in Gaza in 2024, there were calls for America just cutting off support to Israel. And there were actually moves then also to hold back delivery, as I understand it, of certain types of weapon systems before Israel's operation in Rafah. Explain that to me from your perspective at the Pentagon, how you see that, and you match it up with the wider playing field that you just talked about, that Israel's also getting attacked from the northern borders, from Hezbollah, from militias backed by Iran, the Houthis in Yemen, as you were talking about before. Give us a sense of how you actually navigate that and how you then view these calls of simply, if you cut off the support to Israel, this will somehow end these wars.
So after October 7th, President Biden made very clear that there was a U.S. imperative to surge support to Israel. It had faced the worst attack against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, 1,200 people killed, 250 people taken hostage, a real major violation of its sovereignty, but also its sense of its own security. It whet the appetite of others. Hezbollah started firing on October 8th. Rockets, which continued constantly, had to evacuate northern Israel as a result. Later, these Iranian attacks, of course, attacks from militias in Iraq and Syria as well. So President Biden made very clear from the very first days that, including his own visit to Israel, that the United States was going to surge support. And the Pentagon is called upon to execute a lot of that. The State Department has a role too, but Secretary Austin really took very seriously the obligation as a policy and then all of the derivative implementing mechanisms of that policy. The United States is going to defend Israel. So we surged something like $14 billion of aid to Israel. Obviously, that was helped by a congressional passage of a supplemental that took several more months.
Right.
But this was very important. Obviously, it involved also a lot of consultation and advice and drawing on our own experiences. The U.S. has experiences, lessons learned, sometimes by mistakes and sometimes by more successful experiences in fighting terrorist organizations, even in urban areas. Not anything quite like what the Israelis faced with Hamas in Gaza, embedded in the civilian population, under the civilian population in the tunnels, but we did have experiences in Iraq and against ISIS and in Afghanistan against the Taliban that were, our military wanted to share what we learned and see if it could be of some use. So all of this was the policy, and that's the policy, of course, I inherited when I got there in January. Now, at the same time, there was very legitimate concern about civilian casualties, a lot of advice and a lot of discussion about how you could minimize civilian casualties, how you could actually get to Hamas and defeat Hamas and try to minimize the number of civilian casualties.
Do you think they were listening?
I think they listened. I think sometimes they took advice, sometimes they didn't. The Rafah case is an interesting one. There was no withholding of any weapons, but there was a lot of discussion with the Israelis about, okay, there's Hamas brigades still in Rafah and under the tunnels of Rafah, but there's also about 1.8 million Palestinian civilians because so many had evacuated from the north and the center of Gaza into southern Gaza, directed there by the Israelis, by the way. And so the question was, can you conduct the operation against Hamas in Rafah differently than it was conducted in Gaza City, and Khan Yunis, and therefore allow people time to evacuate, get to safe harbor locations, and therefore produce fewer civilian casualties? And so we had a long discussion and a lot of back and forth about what that might look like. And they actually did take time and rebuild their own plan. And in the end, that is actually what happened. Most of the civilians in Rafah did evacuate. There were far lower rates of civilian casualties in Rafah than in the other parts of Gaza from earlier in the war. But at the end of the day, Hamas still was, they were still able to address that threat.
Do you think Israel was doing all of this planning in its campaign with a clear eye of what they saw as an end state? The big advice that President Biden, I saw publicly and I think privately gave, is don't make the mistake that we made in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I know his views, I think he's been clear about it, is that we got stuck in these long wars with no end in sight. Do you think the Israelis actually have today, in 2025, a clear idea of what end state that they're willing to live with?
I don't think they have really landed on their sort of what we've been calling the day after plan. And these were discussions we had, really from the very beginning with them that were, I think, constrained by the politics of Israel. There are a lot of people in the Israeli security establishment that we talked to, our colleagues, who believed and understood and would say, but they'd have to couch their language, that ultimately the only alternative to Israel occupying Gaza or just leaving it as kind of a Mogadishu-style chaos with all the negative things that can emerge from that, or Hamas rebuilding, is a legitimate Palestinian alternative that's prepared to live peacefully in Israel, that's prepared to do the hard work to keep Hamas from reviving, that is supported by Arab states, maybe even facilitated in the early phase by an Arab stabilization force. And the government, the current government of Israel, is very bound up or really enabled to stay in office because it has the support of far-right members like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who will oppose any reference to Palestinian statehood anywhere or any empowerment of the Palestinian Authority, even a reformed or revitalized Palestinian Authority to come in and work on governance in Gaza linked to the governing authority in Ramallah, because we just did.
And the government is led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who for years, tell me if I'm wrong here, essentially agreed to this Faustian bargain where Qatar and other elements were giving resources to Gaza, to the Hamas leaders in Gaza, to essentially keep them on life support.
That's right.
And to divide and conquer.
That's right. And so I don't think they had yet landed on what does that day after look like, and I'm not sure they have now yet either. And so that's this was our military's experience, is that if you don't have a plan for the next phase, our counterinsurgency doctrine is clear, hold, and build. So they would defeat Hamas in an area, but then they wouldn't hold it, and they wouldn't install or enable a different force, Palestinian or Arab or something else, to hold. And so when they would withdraw from there, Hamas would come back in, and then you never got to the hold, and you certainly never got to the build. So Now, back to your question just on weapons. So basically, the vast majority of the commitments that the U.S. had made and the requests that Israel made, continued to flow. Sometimes things were slower bureaucratically in the State Department, or just slower because in the early phase we were able to surge on an emergency basis things we had in stock, and later you don't have as much in stock, or there's only so many times you can go to the emergency declaration before you bypass the congressional review process.
Right.
But there's only one instance of an actual sort of blocked or frozen, I guess I'd say, weapon shipment. And that was a ship in North Carolina that was on its way. These were Israeli weapons already purchased that included 500-pound bombs and 2,000-pound bombs. And at a certain point in May of 2024, President Biden, maybe reacting to some headlines of civilian casualties, I don't know exactly, said, I need, let's pause something. And that's what was paused.
So it was tactical. And
eventually the 500-pound bombs were released. And the question on the table was, is a 2,000-pound bomb an appropriate munition to use in a heavily populated urban environment to get at Hamas terrorists who are clearly there and maybe under there, but with the attendant risks of civilian casualties. And so, I think we in the Pentagon felt like, stalling these types of aid was not ideal. Of course, the president's decision is one we're all bound by, but, better to keep things flowing, in part because of what you sort of alluded to earlier, that Israel's other enemies, Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis, could draw very dangerous conclusions about the idea that Israel being abandoned, and it might whet their appetite to escalate. And our goal all the time was to prevent escalation, prevent broadening of the war. But if, the sense is that the United States is withdrawing support from Israel, that has an empowering effect for all those enemies. We actually had, just sorry to finish the story, we actually had a plan for Minister of Defense Gallant to come to Washington in June or July and sign a commitment not to use that munition in Gaza, where he didn't really feel he needed it at that point, but to use it, to have it available for Lebanon and for other needs. And I think it was on track. And then Prime Minister Netanyahu did a video where he sort of publicly criticized President Biden, and the whole thing got kind of taken off track. And so it remained frozen until after President Trump took office and he released it.
Yeah, I think the other complicating factor, I wonder if you see it from your vantage point, is that in this year of 2024, there's this very delicate and complicated negotiation to try to get to a ceasefire and hostage release. And what I understand is that anytime someone in Hamas or someone in Iran in the broader field saw daylight between Israel and the United States, they would say, aha, our price has gone up.
That's 100% true.
You know that to
That's 100% true. Now, there were times when Prime Minister Netanyahu seemed to add conditions to the deal that President Biden had proposed, which was really based on an original Israeli proposal.
And was that because he wanted to stay in power, or because he believed in something, or what was it?
Well, I mean, he had an argument. He said, for example, Israel needs to stay in the Philadelphia corridor, the strip along the Egyptian border, to prevent the smuggling of weapons into Gaza. And so there was a security argument for it, but a lot of his own members of his own government, certainly members of the Israeli public and military, understood that to be kind of adding a condition in order not to have to do the deal, which was going to be very unpopular with his ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who might pull out of the government. In fact, Ben-Gvir later claimed credit for blocking the deal by forcing Netanyahu to add conditions. True or not, that's what he has said. Now, when we were talking from the Pentagon with the IDF and with Minister of Defense Gallant, he was clear that actually that's not really a security requirement. I can live without troops on the Philadelphia corridor, at least while we get the hostages out. If we have to go back later, we go back later. But that's something I can live with if it gets the hostages out and brings this to an end. So that was true and happening. But everything you said a moment ago was also true. That any time there was an appearance of a public discord between the United States and Israel over these negotiation terms, Hamas has said, "Oh, well, wait a minute, we can get better terms," and they pulled back. So both things were going on, and tragically, those negotiations stretched all the way through 2024.
I hate to leave 2024 because there's a lot of lessons learned here, but I want to hit the rewind button and do it more efficiently, and go back to your experience as U.S. ambassador to Israel, but also the senior director in the Obama administration. And I want to center it on this, is the quest for peace in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians. You essentially were in the hot seat in very senior positions in two attempts. First, George Mitchell, as the peace envoy, announced, I think, on day 1 or 2 of the day 2 of the Obama administration. You were probably there at the State Department. I remember the speech. And then secondly, John Kerry, Martin Indyk, rest in peace, and this sort of all-star team in the second term. And you were ambassador out in Israel at that time. When people struggle with the conflict that we're seeing today, and friends of mine who live in Gaza, West Bank, and others worry about what's to come next, when you look back on those experiences to try to forge a peace between Israelis and Palestinians, what did you get right? And then where did you fall short? And more importantly, where can we take lessons from all of that moving forward?
So just to back up, I came to Washington in 1993, motivated primarily with all the enthusiasm and hubris of youth by solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, and specifically solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
We're going to get to that.
Okay, we'll get to it.
Yeah.
So for me to work on those issues in the NSC, devising the President of the United States, who had identified as priorities, you said,
Dream come true.
the second day it was the dream job. And I never thought I'd have that opportunity to happen through all sorts of different things. And I really was proud that President Obama had identified that as an early priority. It was Senator Mitchell's appointment. We made very little progress in that first term.
Why?
With Senator Mitchell? Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu had also just come back to power. And I think, he was, he had never endorsed a Palestinian state or a two-state solution. He had tried to
Bar-Ilan University?
Well, no, before he came back in. And
Yeah.
He had tried to back away from the Oslo Accords in his first term in the late 90s. But he did then, in June of 2009, say in his speech at Bar-Ilan University that, he could envision a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes the Jewish state. So that was a breakthrough.
Yeah.
But then, the Palestinians, insisted on a settlement freeze as a condition to even come to the table. And we spent many, many months sort of chasing a very difficult negotiation with the Israelis about what does a freeze mean, how much, or, when. And we wasted a lot of time, which I, took to ultimately understand, really we were dealing with a Prime Minister, Netanyahu, and a President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, who really didn't trust each other. They actually did come together 2 or 3 meetings, I think it was 3 meetings in September of 2009. They were pretty disastrous. Their discussions, it was September 2010. It took us a year and a half to even get them to the table. Mm-hmm. And all of their limited interactions confirmed their worst suspicions of the other, that each was really only trying to, buy time and make sure the other side took blame.
Yeah.
Wouldn't make any of the...
So leadership matters.
Leadership matters a huge deal. So one of my conclusions from this was leadership matters. And that we did not have the leaders who had temperament, relationship, trust, domestic political circumstances, decision-making styles, that they were going to be able to make the decisions that would ultimately be required. When Secretary Kerry came into office in the beginning of 2015.
And he was like the Energizer Bunny on this issue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was already in Tel Aviv, and of course I had done that whole negotiation the first term, and those were some of my conclusions. And so I actually wrote him a long memo when he first came in, and I said, look, we were here in the first term, you're coming in now, here are my impressions of, the dynamics and the leadership, people involved, and the prospects of a major breakthrough on a two-state solution are very low. So we might want to think about some alternatives,
right,
laying out some U.S. parameters, or even stating that we're prepared to do some policy planning around alternatives to two states, because we might end up in one of them. And it might be a good idea to figure out what we think about that, even if it's not our preference.
Right.
Because, and even just the shock to say that might get people to say, wait a minute, you better go back to the first choice. He, as you said, was an Energizer Bunny. He was running 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
He really was convinced that he had an an ability to, as a politician, to speak to these two political leaders and get them to make decisions. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. He proved me wrong, by the way. I did not think he'd get them to the table. And just by sheer force of personality and relentlessness, 15 trips, something like that, he did get them to the table in September of 2013 for a commitment to a 9-month period to negotiate a final status agreement. And again, good on him for the effort. It was not too difficult, and of course, Martin Indyk was a big part of that. One of our great luminaries in this field, blessed memory. Good on him for getting that started. But it was pretty easy to see the minefield in month 8 that was going to lead to the breakdown of these talks in month 9. Now, of course, nobody's a genius for predicting failure in Middle East peace talks. I don't want to pat myself on the back too much for that. But we kind of could see it coming. It did come. Yeah. When it broke down in March, April of 2014, often when these things break down, they're punctuated by violence. And it's hard to say exactly because Hamas had a vote in this. They were, of course, weren't part of the talks. But, then there was that terrible war in the summer of 2014, precipitated by a Hamas kidnapping of Jewish teens in the West Bank and rockets fired and Israel response. And it lasted for 7 weeks. It was really terrible. But I definitely concluded that leadership matters and that in that period, we might want to look for ways of preserving the option of a two-state solution for a bit later and using some other techniques other than direct negotiations to do that. Well, I thought that in 2009, 10, 11. Guess what? It's 2025. Right. We're still the same two leaders, but right? Yeah, nothing.
That's another key lesson. Maybe you need to have refresh.
Of course,
hit the Control-Alt-Delete button, if you will.
Right now, of course, October 7th also changes the outlook on this altogether. And I say it with a heavy heart that I'm not. What I once thought was inevitable, just a matter of time, different leaders, a two-state solution. I don't see it as inevitable at all. Yeah, and I think it might well be that we were going to have to find different approaches, or at least a different approach to that version, but it's going to take much longer. No Israeli can have that conversation yet. I understand why. And until we know that there's Palestinian leadership that wouldn't either be Hamas or fall into, be taken over by Hamas or fall into that trap, there's no even conversation to have about, what can be on the other side of that border. That we must have is Hamas's defeat and removal from power in Gaza, or we really got nowhere to go.
So maybe one of the lessons from the second round that Kerry led and Martin Indyk and others is that you've got to try to find a way to isolate the extremists.
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, this was definitely the case that the success, let's put it this way, the successful Arab-Israeli negotiations, think of the Israel-Egypt peace treaty in the late 70s, which was kind of unexpected, that Menachem Begin, seen as a hardliner, and Anwar Sadat, who had led Egypt to war against Israel, would, take some risk, build some trust, not perfect trust, but then defend the decision they had made to make this peace and Israel to relinquish land and Egypt to end its state of war against the extremists in their own sides. And I think King Hussein and Yitzhak Rabin did the same in 1994 in the Jordan Treaty. And that is something that's obviously going to be necessary, and you need certain kinds of leaders who can, sort of drive toward that partnership on the other side against the extremists on their own side. Very difficult and sort of much harder when the societal mistrust is as deep as it is for all the understandable reasons.
Yeah. So 2 last questions, and on this leadership point, before I get to the 2 last questions, I had Itamar Rabinovich on the Middle East Focus podcast about a year and a half ago. And we were talking about his book, and this was pre-October 7th, and he talked about the dearth of leadership across the Middle East and who he worked for in Yitzhak Rabin and people who had the vision. And that's essential, I think, in the society of leaders who actually don't just respond to the stimulus that they have and the forces that are against them and then project that as a mirror, but then try to lead people to a new place forward. I want to pivot to sort of the question of where America is today and its politics. And I don't want to get into like Democrats versus Republicans, but I want to get into the nature of the discourse about the Middle East. And I've talked with Stephen Cook on a previous podcast about center-left and left sort of challenges. I noticed an exchange you had in March of this year on social media. I dip into it. I don't engage that much too. But you were in the chief Pentagon position on Yemen and the Houthis, as we talked about before. And people can be critical of whether Biden did enough and was bold enough. And I don't want to get into that too much. But the debate I noticed in the last week or so with the Trump administration initiating attacks against the Houthis is that you were supportive of this and you wrote a foreign policy article that was about that. But then you were criticized from somebody who comes from more of a conservative strand, served in the first Trump administration, in a way that this person said, sit down to you and said, you don't really have agency or a voice that matters in this debate. And I wonder how that feels to be the target of that. And then what does that mean in terms of how do we build a much more cohesive, stronger approach to the world, not let alone the Middle East and to our country? How do we actually build coalitions and build relationships as opposed to fragment them?
Yeah, I got a pretty thick skin. I mean, you serve as U.S. ambassador to Israel in the Obama administration, and you're accused of being, an ardent supporter of genocide against Palestinians.
You've seen it before.
Totally abandoning our ally Israel in the face of the attacking hordes. So I don't take it personally.
Yeah.
I think there's always value. I consider myself a centrist or center left sort of Democrat.
Yeah.
I think there's always value in finding areas of bipartisan agreement. I think.
Can we find that today?
I think there is on some issues. I think there is always value in civil discourse, of course. This was a kind of interesting case because, I'm very critical of the Trump administration on many things. I think he is certainly not my choice for president. I think he's going to do a lot of damage to the United States. And even internationally, I've been very critical on Ukraine,
right,
Canada, and other things.
But you want us to succeed.
But from my own experience, dealing with the challenge that the Houthis present, this is a terrorist organization located on a maritime choke point, is closing down international commercial shipping, firing ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and attack drones at U.S. warships. It's just completely unacceptable. If we allow it to continue, it will metastasize.
So that's the real world.
But that's right.
And then you have the X and social media.
Right. So my view was that we in the Biden administration did a fair bit to try to degrade their capabilities, but we didn't deter them. We weren't successful. Partly because it takes time to develop the intelligence to attack leaders and maybe do the things that maybe the Trump administration is trying to do now. But I supported it then, and I support it now. And I was saying so. I was saying, I support the Trump administration conducting these strikes. I have some additional thoughts based on the experience. There are some other tools besides military tools that they haven't yet spoken to.
Yeah.
Whether that's additional sanctions tools, whether that's holding Iran to account. Actually, they have spoken to that, and I support that as well. Whether it's interdictions of weapon shipments, whether it's supporting a political process inside Yemen, so that if you're successful in eliminating the Houthi leadership, hard, but I hope they succeed, that you then have then what? You have some kind of consensus leadership emerge that will prevent either the reemergence of Houthi attacks or the pulling Saudi Arabia back into a civil war that we'd have worked hard to wind down. There's a political process that should be, as we were talking about with Gaza earlier, you should always have a political process that you're trying to achieve through your military means. So I was sort of simply articulating that. And look, I think when people are going to speak up and state their views, and I always try to do it in a civil way, it's good to have civil discourse about that. So I think we, and I'll say it collectively, because I'm sure it's true of people in my party as well. I've tried not to contribute to this, but, have tended to sort of alight on, rather partisan and accusatory exchanges on the Iran nuclear deal, for example.
Yeah.
It
becomes very tribal.
They're very tribal and very black and white, either for it or against it. And if you're against it, you're a warmonger. If you're for it, you're a appeaser. And, not taking into account the complexity and the real world options you have and the trade-offs you have to make, maybe the downsides of an agreement or the downsides of withdrawing from an agreement. To some degree, the discourse around U.S.-Israel relations have also become sort of partisan. And I think I have to say, in this case, I think it's a bit more on the Republican side that they've said, we're the friends of Israel and, Democrats are not. Now,
right.
Look, I mean, there are definitely Democrats I disagree with on various things relating to this. But I think, there are lots of people like me and like President Biden and like Lloyd Austin, who are, strong supporters of that relationship. Doesn't mean we can't disagree or criticize on certain policies, but are fundamentally committed to that partnership and fundamentally committed to trying to help Israel achieve a better set of relationships with all of its neighbors, certainly Arab neighbors, and where possible, and it's going to be a lot harder after October 7th with its Palestinian neighbors. So, I think we'd all be better served by a less polarized, less tribal, less black and white discourse. I know politics is politics, so that may not be how these. It's certainly not on social media.
Yeah,
these,
but it's gotten worse since the time that you came in 1993 on the Hill and other things.
Yeah, that is true.
Harder.
Look, it's definitely got harder. I mean, social media, I'm sure, plays a lot of that. There was none of that in 1993. But look, when the Clinton administration embraced the Oslo Accords, which were really an Israeli-Palestinian initiative that the U.S. was sort of not directly involved in the initial phases, but it was an outgrowth of a George H.W. Bush initiative, which was the Madrid Peace Conference. And in much of the 90s, and I would say much of the, well into the George W. Bush and probably into the Obama administration, you had a much greater degree of consensus that two states was the right direction. George W. Bush was the first president to publicly articulate two states as the goal. And you could be supportive of Israel, and you could be supportive of two states, and you could be from either party, and you could support aid programs that would support Israel's security and also support the development of Palestinian institutions and economy. And that wasn't nearly as partisan. There were always echoes of that, but it wasn't nearly as partisan. I think, in the last decade, and a lot of it started during the Obama administration and then sort of hit its crescendo with the Iran nuclear deal.
Right.
I think we in the last decade have been subject to much more partisan invective than is healthy or even reflective of the reality and to the real trade-offs any government of any party is
right. But then back to the real world, and just referencing something you said earlier in the discussion, is that even with this madcap, crazy, unpredictable Trump 2.0 administration, and who knows where they'll go, there's certain things that they just went with, which was first initially, at least until recent days, the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, but then importantly, trying to maintain the work that Amos Hochstein and all of you or in the Biden administration did on the Israel-Hezbollah Lebanon ceasefire deal. So continuity in U.S. foreign policy is not dead. The thing that you teach undergraduates about U.S. foreign policy is that it's actually hard to turn the ship on these things and change things. Right?
Yeah, well, I started this podcast by talking about some of the things they've done and I agree with, right? The ceasefire and Lebanon and the Houthi strikes and, so and the Syria negotiations. So look, I think there are interests that I hope they advance. And when they do, I'll support them. Again, President Trump's not my choice for president, but he is the president.
Yeah.
I will criticize what I disagree with. I will try to do it respectfully and not in a partisan flamethrower context. But when they do things that I think are in the U.S. national interest,
to call it
Middle East or elsewhere, I'll say so.
That's your job.
And I'll try to convince others to do so as well. So that's my approach. I think I try to think it's the healthiest approach. And it's not going to change whether I'm going to support him, in the big picture. I think there's a lot of things he's doing domestically, and we talked about Doge, and we didn't even get into all of those details that I think are quite harmful. But the U.S.'s national interests in the Middle East, and as you kind of alluded to, any administration, even of a very different character and a very different philosophy, is probably at least sometimes going to pursue what I think is the right way to protect those interests. Yeah. I hope it will be encompassed in a broader approach I can support, but I will support what our government does that I think advances our interests.
So last question, and I'm sorry I'm pressing the limits of our time here, but I think it's really important. We have a lot of young people who listen to the podcast. We're .edu at MEI. We've been around for more than 78 years. We're committed to this ethos of helping people who are interested in this part of the world, especially those who want to make their career in it. And someone who looks at you and says, wow, you've done amazing things. What would you say, first, what's your origin story? How'd you get interested in this part of the world? And then second, two-part question, what would you advise people today to do to follow in your footsteps?
When I became ambassador to Israel, I said that I could draw a straight line from something that happened to me when I was 4 years old to that particular opportunity and appointment I had. With when I was 4, my parents decided to take a sabbatical semester in Israel. My parents are academics from Illinois.
What part of Illinois?
Champaign, Illinois,
Okay.
University of Illinois. And they decided to take a one sabbatical, and I was going to work on a book, and they wanted to experience a little time in Israel. Went there with 3 young kids. I was the youngest of the 3. And we were having this, great experience, kind of exploring Jerusalem and getting to know the country until Yom Kippur. It was 1973.
Wow.
It was the fall of 1973. So we lived in Israel during the 1973 war. Jerusalem was never bombed. We did spend time in bomb shelters. It was scary. We did know people who had gone off to fight. We knew families who lost people. But, I was 4 years old, right? So I don't remember every detail of it. I certainly didn't understand all of it at the time. But it became part of our kind of family history and family narrative. And it often then what was happening in the Middle East, Israel, peace talks, Egypt, war in Lebanon, Intifada, whatever, was often the subject of a discussion around the dinner table. My parents' ample bookshelves filled up with biographies and history and fiction from the region. And it really drove me to want to spend more time there. I was a student then in Jerusalem twice, after high school and then a year of college at Hebrew University. And that led me to make sure I understood the place, study Hebrew, got good at Hebrew, study Arabic.
And did you experience Palestinians?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I studied Arabic as well. I became good friends with Palestinians from East Jerusalem.
Right.
I made sure to spend time in the West Bank. I guess when I was early in college, the first Intifada broke out. And so that was happening when I was there on the second tour. And, I really tried to understand the narrative of both sides, and I tried to understand the possibilities. And I would say I was an early adopter of the idea of a 2-state solution.
Uh-huh.
Right? This was not it wasn't U.S. policy, and it was not common, as discussion about what the outcome would be. But by 88, 89, I had pretty much figured out for myself that I thought that was the right direction of things. Then I'm in grad school at Harvard in 1991 to 93. And I really thought at that point, even though I was interested in those issues, I was going to get a PhD in history and go on to an academic career.
Right.
But I decided kind of to test the waters, and I applied for an internship at the State Department.
Nice.
And I was sent to the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi and the Consulate General in Dubai.
What year?
1992.
Uh-huh.
So it's a year after the first Gulf War.
Wow.
These, at the time, were 2 very small missions. They're much bigger now. And so the political officer goes on vacation for the summer. Suddenly the graduate intern is the political officer, acting political officer.
Amazing.
So I had real work to do. It wasn't just sitting on the visa line. I was
Yeah.
writing serious analytical cables about Iran's aggression against UAE territory in the Persian Gulf and the islands, or the Arab Gulf, the islands there. I was doing real diplomacy at the UAE Foreign Ministry. And I figured out about myself that I was really much more energized and turned on by doing policy work, doing policy analysis, trying to solve problems through diplomacy than the academic track of teaching and writing books, which I have great respect for. I come from that stock.
Sure.
But it was, I figured out what I wanted. So I shifted the rest of the graduate degree into a Middle East foreign policy, Middle East modern diplomatic history and U.S. foreign policy degree. Came to Washington in 1993. And again, as I said earlier, with all the enthusiasm and hubris of youth that I'm here to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, I'm here to build a 2-state solution.
Right.
And about 3 months after I arrived, before I even had my first job in government, the Oslo Accords were announced.
Right.
The big handshake on the White House lawn, which I was not invited to, with Bill Clinton and Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. And my brain kind of split in two. One half of my brain said, it's amazing. Peace is here. It's happening. It's the dream. And the other half of my brain said, darn it, I missed my chance. They did it without me. Well, sadly, the latter was not true. So it became permanent employment in the field. But look,
hopefully not permanent.
I hope I can put myself out of business before it's over. But I definitely then spent my years in Congress in the 90s, early 2000s, and then obviously leading into the Obama campaign and administration, saying, look, the United States has unique interests and unique abilities to be the convener, to be the guarantor, to be the supporter of Israel's security, of Palestinian aspirations, hopefully building a bigger community of moderates in the region that sort of came later with the Abraham Accords. And I still think that's true, but I'm much more sober now. I'm maybe not now after this podcast, but I'm much more, I'm much more realistic that, what I once thought was inevitable is not inevitable.
Right.
And, that thing I said earlier about advice I gave to Secretary Kerry was, we should do some policy planning around alternatives to a two-state solution,
Right.
because we might end up in one. And we definitely, post-October 7th, might end up in one, or one that looks very different on the versions. In fact, I had worked with Shir Efron, who I know you had as an earlier guest, and some others on a Israel Policy Forum study that actually, this was 2020.
They did the cross of like, what are the alternatives?
Exactly, on what those alternatives are. They're all bad, by the way. And so you're kind of searching for the least bad, and how do you protect U.S. interests in the alternatives? And a lot of the conclusions drives you back to say, geez, is there any way we can still keep some version of two states alive? Because that's probably still the best or least bad outcome. But, post-October 7th, I'm realistic. Unless Hamas, first of all, I've always said, since October 7th, unless Hamas is really defeated and really removed from power in Gaza, there's no post-conflict.
Yeah.
There's no day after.
Yeah.
They must be removed. And I think we've missed opportunities. The Arab states certainly have not done enough. Palestinians themselves have to rise up to say, this cannot be. We cannot have this organization still leading. Obviously, got to get hostages out.
Right.
If we're able to get to that point, it's still a tough journey to get Israelis and Palestinians to see each other as potential peace partners for the future. But obviously, that's my origin story, and I would still look for a way to do.
No, and thanks for sharing that with us. And listen, you kids out there, and I can say kids because I'm a bit older now these days. Is listen to what Ambassador Dan Shapiro has said. Get out in the world, connect with people, learn their language, keep an open mind.
You have to spend time in the region. If you want to work in this region, you must spend time there.
You can't look at it on paper.
You can't look on paper. You must meet people where they are. You must learn their languages, learn their culture, learn their religion, learn their food, and sit with them. And it's to understand them. And it's not because if you're going to work in the U.S. government, you have any less of a commitment to what is the U.S. interest. That is the goal here as any U.S. official, to advance our interests. But our interests are always going to be bound up in the partnerships we can build with others in the region. And the more you have that understanding and the more you have those relationships and the more you kind of have sat in people's homes and in a way, at least metaphorically, walked in their shoes, the better chance you have to be successful.
Thank you, Dan, for a very enlightening and sober conversation. I appreciate you coming here and sharing your insights with us. That's all the time we have this week. Again, thank you to our listeners for tuning in and our colleagues for our work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for our latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We'll see you all soon.